Cool, so today I'm going to be talking about design logic in general. So basically I'm going to be talking about making higher quality websites through this lost art of design interrogation. So what is design interrogation, and what's going on with this spooky kind of cave theme I've got going on here? I'm going to get into that in a moment. But first I want to challenge you a little bit. So I'm assuming we've probably got some people who would call themselves full stack developers in the room, or maybe you lean more towards back end or more towards front end. And I really want to challenge you on what it means to be full stack. Normally as developers we think of it as encompassing all of the different technology stuff, so all the programming concepts, from things like databases on the back end, caching, all the way through to CSS, HTML, and then it kind of stops, right? And it sort of becomes a completely different profession. But what I want to do today is to try and challenge you that actually designers in the realm of design, really it's a continuation of what we do as developers. And I want to talk about how actually what designers do is less about being artsy these days and more actually about implementing algorithms and logic and patterns, and actually they have more in common with us. So a little bit about me. So I'm originally from New Zealand, hence the very strange accent, which hopefully you'll get used to. I've been working as a front-end developer for over 10 years now. I'm currently working for Evolving Web. So Evolving Web, I do mostly Drupal, but also WordPress as well. And I've settled in Montreal in Canada, which I love. And I always wanted to be an archaeologist. So I remember when I was 7 years old, the teacher came to us one day and she said, "What do you all want to be when you grow up?" And everyone said things like teachers and policemen. And I remember I went to my sister and I asked her, "What's the name of those people that go digging for bones?" And she said archaeologist. And I was so proud of myself as a 7-year-old saying this huge, long word. So hence the theme I've got going on here. And of course, thank you to our sponsors. So a round of applause for the sponsors, please. Nice, now let's get into it. So I want to take you on a little bit of a journey here, okay? Imagine you're an archaeologist and you're digging somewhere in the world, maybe you're excavating an old cave, and you look in here and you find some scrolls, perhaps some dead CSS scrolls, if you will. And on one of the scrolls you see this figure here, an ancient developer, sitting at his office computer. And he's very happy with himself. He's been working on a website, maybe for a university, maybe for some sort of government organization. And he's maybe a front-end developer, and he's about to finish building the website, and everything's going great, and he's coming towards the end of the process. He's very happy with himself. And this is something I'm sure you're all familiar with, right? And then another developer has a look at the project, okay? And he spots some bugs, and most of them are no big deal. But he spots a really, really tricky front-end bug. And you can't figure out a nice, clean fix for it. So what do? You get thinking, and I've been here as well, right? Where you can't really think of a nice little bit of code that's going to fix it. And so you use maybe a hacky CSS parent selector override. So maybe it's the case that all of the cards on the about page look different somehow. And so you use this hacky CSS parent selector override where you target all the cards on the about page to look a bit different. And you're not proud of it, but you put it live, and it's fine. And then maybe your manager has a look at it as well, and he spots a few bugs, but there's a few other tricky bugs, okay? Okay, we've got two other tricky bugs we need to fix. And what do? We do another hacky parent CSS selector override, and our old trusty friend, the important flag. Now this is a nice little thing to keep in our back pocket. You don't really want to be using it too much, but it kind of does the job, right? If you haven't structured things correctly, you tend to have to lean on this. And we'll put it live, and we'll just skip the QA review maybe for now. We'll skip kind of code review, and all is well and good. Oh gosh, and then the designers have a look. And the designers are pretty harsh critics, right? Because they're the ones who have actually built the design. It might be a nice Figma design. There's lots of nice rules in there that they want to surface in there. And the designers find three really tricky fronting bugs. And so what do? Another parent says selector override. You do another important flag. And maybe you do a weird CSS utility class. So I'm sure we've all done these before. These are the weird ones like no borders when empty. Something really strange like that. The QA team. Okay, so now we're finally going into testing. Just another 4 front-end bugs. We'll do another hacky override, another important flag, another weird utility class, and we'll duplicate a chunk of code. I'm sure you've all been there before where maybe you just duplicate all the menu code and you just copy and paste it somewhere else. It's not very dry, but it kind of does the job. And our poor developer friend over here is a little bit frustrated. And now for the final boss, right? So you've passed all your checks, but then you need to hand it over to your client and they want to have a look at it as well. And they start finding bugs too. So how did we get into this tricky position? A developer is a bit cross and he's really lacking the tools to try and solve this problem. And it all started out pretty good, right? So quite naturally what we did is we started out building this website from the beginning by taking those design tokens from Figma, the spacing measurements, the colors, the typography, and just copying across those values. Okay, so you're just taking those, the numbers, the colors, the names of everything, and we're just copying them one for one into our code. Okay, but this is kind of the root of the problem because just copying across the values is really annoying, is really ignoring the underlying logic of what's going on. So that's what I'm trying to introduce you to today, this concept of design logic and the fact that designers are more logicians than what we give them credit for. So what do I mean by design logic? I'm really talking about the underlying patterns and logic and algorithms that govern designers. I'm talking about the big picture here. So it's less about copying and pasting just variables from a design and really trying to understand what the designer intended. By fully interrogating the design, we can come to a more accurate understanding, so we can get that big picture view on how things are supposed to be working. So let's go for a really, really simple example here, line height. So as a developer, you might see in a Figma design that the font size somewhere is 24 pixels and the line height is 32 pixels. And maybe you just kind of treat it as just that, and you just copy those two values. But is there really like an underlying logic in here that we can kind of tease out? And already you might see that the line height is about 1 1/3 times the font size. And we can use this because there will inevitably be blanks that we will have to fill in as developers. So the design might be pretty complete already, but for example, things like CK editor, you might need to have styles for the H2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that maybe the designer hasn't accounted for. Understanding this logic will help you really code things on your own without having to turn to the designer. But is this even the full story? Because, and this is true on almost every website you've probably ever worked on, but really it's a little bit more complicated than that because line heights tend to be tighter the bigger the font sizes, and this is just a universal thing that I've noticed that all designers do. They tend to basically just give a more chunky line height on smaller font, and that's just because you need a little bit more visual separation when the fonts are smaller. So it's less about actually copying a formula, a specific formula like this, but really understanding what the designer is trying to do behind the scenes. So let's go for a much bigger example now, something like color. So here you can see here I've just got a scattering of different design elements. So you might have a heading, you might have links, maybe all the links on your website are blue, maybe the icons are all green, and I've purposefully picked quite dark colours here for a reason, so apologies if it's not contrasting very well. But let's say, as a developer on your own, you have to come up with an inverted colour scheme, okay? Maybe it's like a dark mode, or maybe on the particular paragraph, maybe you can just toggle this to be dark or light. How would we flip those colours? I mean, ideally we would see that in a design somewhere, but maybe not all of this stuff is accounted for. So usually, if it's a dark colour, it will be flipped to white. Again, this is true on almost all websites. Dark colours flip to full white. I'm not quite sure why, but basically full white is a much more common colour on the web than full black. And you see, even the link there is probably going to flip to full white as well. Not super accessible, so maybe we want a different kind of colour there as well, so we don't just rely on the underline for the link. But this is just a pattern, and so it's less about just copying this particular rule. It's more about looking in the design and seeing what the designer is trying to do with their colours in their design. So here's another example, the rich text field, okay, something from CK Editor. So this is a super common one. You can put tons and tons of stuff in there, and maybe the designer hasn't fully accounted for everything you can put into a rich text field. So let's try and flip those colours to white, but notice we also have the other secondary colour in there. So we might flip these to white, and then notice actually in the design, whenever there is an orange kind of yellowish colour like we had there, it's normally flipped to a blue perhaps. Okay, so it's about leveraging those, that logic that lives in the design. So some takeaways here. Yeah, one very, very important one is basically all dark text and all kind of dark colours are often just full white when they become reversed. I don't want to make this too much about coding, but we can use things like current colour to easily flip colours. So this is going to change the entire way that we actually build things. So there's actually pretty big consequences on your code, or the way that you do coding, based on how the designer is actually building things logically. We might not want, colours put straight into code anywhere in the design based on this. Maybe we want to always have some sort of logical switching going on across the whole website. Layout is another really, really big one where logic comes into play. So here we have a typical carousel, might be like a swiper carousel, where you have arrows, you have these little pagination dots down the bottom. This image could be any kind of shape. It could be a square, it could be a rectangle, who knows. It might also change depending on the screen size. And obviously it's going to change as well when there's different text in there. So this is one that's ripe for breaking. Whenever the content changes or the screen size changes, we need to make sure that nothing is overlapping here. So rather than just copying the pixel values from Figma and putting them straight into our code, we're going to try and see what logically is going on. And this might be the kind of formula that you want to go for. Again, the formula itself is not super important. We're just trying to think of this in a way that is going to make sure that things are not going to break and we're going to be coding in a more defensive kind of way. So we're preserving these safe areas on the left and the right. And same thing for the bottom bar as well. So we're going to be making sure there's a safe area there, which might be twice that bottom padding area, plus the size of the dots. So some takeaways here. We really want to study the relationship between the different design elements. So it's less about just identifying things in isolation in the Figma, and more about seeing how they interact with each other, which is not immediately obvious when you're just looking at a static design, but it's about trying to intuit how things are supposed to behave in relation to each other. We're trying to identify the logic and the algorithms behind things. And in some cases, we're going to be deriving our own measurements in there. I might say 100 pixels, maybe we turn that into a percentage or something else like that. Spacing, this is a really, really important one. So you've probably seen pages on a website, mostly the home page is made up of these kind of stacked horizontal blocks. It never used to be the case back in the day that most sites were designed like this. But these days you'll see that, especially home pages and other landing pages, they're made up of these stacked blocks. They might be paragraphs, for example, on your site, and you can rearrange them in any order. You can maybe change the background color as well. And hopefully, the designers made it very easy for us, and they've given every single block the same sort of spacing value in there. So this might not be the case. Maybe some obviously have more or less. But let's just assume there's 100 pixels spacing in here. Now, is that the end of the story? As you can probably suspect, no. For example, what if we change one of these blocks to have a different background color? Or for example, maybe we drag another block up the top that has the same color. Now, by changing the color, you actually have a design error in here. That spacing there is actually really huge. This is something we don't often talk of as developers, but simply by changing the color of something, you have to change the spacing. And this is true on almost every website you've ever worked on. So if you change the color of a block, the spacing needs to change as well. So really, in your code, you need to have mechanisms in there that actually detect which blocks come before or after it and change that spacing dynamically based on that. So here we have that really large spacing. And if you look in the design, you'll probably see it's something a lot smaller when two blocks of the same color are adjacent to each other. So the spacing between blocks is actually determined by the color. So when you change the color of blocks, the height of the whole page is going to change subtly. There's a lot of different ways we could code this. We could take advantage of the CSS has selector. So maybe we change the spacing on a block based on which block comes after it. And then really this is about, overall, it's less of let's ask the designer and more about trying to look for that hidden logic that the designer has put in their designs already. So to sum all of this up, as developers we have more in kind with designers than we think. And as someone who is, I guess self-confessed, like a front-end developer, I often see myself as being sort of in that middle ground between a designer and a developer. I also want to convince you that, or hopefully I already have, that design is a profession that is rooted in logic. So it's less of that kind of artsy sort of job that we think of it as, or at least used to think of it as, and something that is actually a lot closer to what we do today. But why do we find all of this stuff unintuitive? Why do we always have this hard break between developers who encompass many, many different things, and then designers who sort of sit very, very separately in their own world? So I want to cast your mind back in time a little bit. This is probably not a term you've used to describe yourself, probably in the last 15 years maybe. But I think at one stage, we were all in this category of web designers And over time it has fragmented out into different professions over the years as we've become more and more specialised. But certainly when I was a teenager, I remember thinking that when I grew up I want to be a web designer. So that was part of the job title, which really doesn't exist anymore. These days you would never find a job posting looking for a web designer. That's sort of an archaic thing. And really it comes from this time of the early web. We have things like GeoCities. I actually never used GeoCities. In the early days I did a lot of my early web development stuff on Neopets. I don't know if anyone, hands up if you ever did some Neopets coding. Yeah, we got one person. Yeah, and you could basically do the same thing. You could just put any CSS you want in there, any HTML. And this is kind of a time when we were all tinkering on the web. In those days, we were all web designers because we were all coders. And there really were no professional designers even in the room in those days of the early web. So here's a really classic old website, Space Jam, for the Space Jam movie, which is still online today if you want to go and check it out, from the 90s. So this is a professional website, a really, really early one obviously, but again, in those days people weren't working in these very, very specialised specific roles. They were all kind of pitching in and trying to just really make it up. They were tinkering around, seeing what the web could do, stretching its limits, and they were sort of closer together in terms of what their roles were. And this is my totally unscientific breakdown of how, at least in my mind, things have kind of split over the years. So you have that early kind of concept of the web designer, which then split into developer and designer once the professional creatives got into the room. Then developer became much too, not specific enough, so we needed to have back end and front end. These days even that is sort of starting to become a little bit too broad. We have UI developers, front end, that's what I would call myself. We have SBA development. So these days front-end developers are sometimes doing more Node.js stuff. Then you have back-end, which is also fragmenting into different things. And designers, meanwhile, are way over there in their own totally isolated branch. And in doing my research for this, I found this really, really interesting article from the very early 2000s, over 25 years ago, in fact, on a list apart, which is a really, really awesome web design and web development resource. And it's from this guy, this systems administrator. And even back then, the fragmentation in our industry was really starting to take form. And in this article he says, how can we work together if we don't understand each other? Okay, systems administrator Robert Miller describes the view from his side of the cubicle and attempts to break down the barriers between creative and systems professionals. So already it was starting to be talked about over 25 years ago. And this article is still online if you want to take a look at that as well. And he says in the article, I've made a point of working as closely as I can with my developers and designers, and I'm a much better sysadmin for the effort. And you might read this and think, oh well, wasn't there already a breakdown back in those days? And I started to think that too when I was reading this. I thought actually, maybe this kind of mythological idea of the web designer is something that doesn't really exist. And I started to read further. I've been able to show the designers how servers work so they can reduce the amount of time they spend trying to put stuff where they think it should be and focus on making pretty and functional UIs. So this is a really old quote, but something that still, I think, resonates today and seems pretty accurate. But then, really, really interestingly, towards the end of the article, he puts some clever definitions for us. He says the definitions I use are: a developer is someone who creates server-side code that translates objects into HTML. And for him, a designer is someone who creates HTML images and client-side scripting. So basically, there really were no real, actual trained designers in the room. I mean, mostly these people were all coders of some description. So where were the actual trained designers in that time? I mean, in those days they were mostly still in the printing world or doing other things in film or television. And that's purely because back then web design techniques were extremely limited. I'm sure you'll remember way back in the days, you couldn't even use any colour you wanted, right? You had this very limited web-safe colour palette that you could use. You could barely even use which font you wanted, depending on your browser. You couldn't really do anything that you wanted. You could try and hack it if you included images. You could use an image of a rounded corner if you really wanted to, but back in these days, nothing was really possible, and so designers naturally weren't very interested. So back in those days, web design was mostly just the realm of, web geeks, like I'm sure all of us in the room. So what happened when designers did come to the table? So when designers did come to the table, I think things were a little bit different. So web design was a little bit more heavy on the artistry and experimentation. I remember when I first got started, there were a lot more images being used, for example, like background images and patterns and subtle things going on. You might have different background images behind the header and the footer. So things were a lot more artsy, I guess you could say, in the early days. But this slowly matured into the industry that we know today, which is a lot more scientific, it's more research-based. We talk about UX research and how it informs everything a designer does these days. So as it's become that more scientific kind of profession, it's actually become closer to what we do as developers these days. So let's go back to our caveman. So we're going to try in this next part of the presentation to try and see if we can dig up ourselves some design logic, or at least find it where it's missing, because sometimes designers don't give us all the clues that we need in the design. So let's try and see if we can root that out and maybe create our own design logic where we need to. So our mission, we're going to root out where design logic is needed. We're going to interrogate the design, so we're really going to try and put ourselves in the mind of the designer when we do this. And we're going to create our own logic and algorithms as we go. And of course, this is all going to be done while liaising with the designer. We're not just going to go rogue here. So we will do checks and things like that as well. But this is a lot about trying to come up with better questions we can ask them. So here's one really, really common example. You've got a mobile menu here. So you click the burger icon and the menu comes up. And at first glance, it kind of looks pretty self-explanatory, pretty straightforward. But there is that hidden devil in the details, which is that each item in the menu here has kind of two implicit functions going on, where maybe you have a news page, but tapping that item could also expand a menu. It kind of looks like there's a sub-menu here. So when you're actually on the website, you're not quite sure whether tapping an item is actually going to go to the page or whether it's going to expand a menu. So let's just recap that situation. So each row of the menu has two functions. It could click to go to the page, or it could expand the menu. There's no visual separation, and that's why it's a bit confusing. And because of that, there's really no clue in the design for how this should be handled. The designer hasn't really put that visual separation in there so that we can try and do that on our own. So there's obviously one very, very simple solution. Maybe we just put some sort of division in there. And that looks pretty gross, I'm not going to lie, it doesn't look great. It doesn't look as clean as what we had before. But it is one solution to this problem. What I've seen done mostly these days is that tapping on that item will always expand the menu. And the link to the page will exist as like the first item in the menu. So it's about trying to come up with better questions that you can ask the designer rather than just doing things like this on your own. Here's another classic example that always drives me crazy, which is images. Specifically things like hero images. So this might be a block that has to go full width, full height. This is like a hero block on a page. You've got this really tricky text box overlaid, and we need to make sure that that person that is reading there is never cropped, okay? And that's actually a very tricky thing to do because depending on the page size, depending on what image you try to put in there, that might not work. So their image needs to span the full width and height of the screen. The focal point, the person probably, needs to always be in view. And content editors need to have some confidence so that when they go into Drupal and they change that image, that it's actually going to come through, and they don't need to do a lot of trial and error to try and get that right. So here you can see on a really wide screen, the top of that person's head is cropped away. On a tablet screen, again, also really, really tricky there with that text box. And on a mobile device, it's probably doing something completely different, which makes it even harder as well. So once we've identified these problems, we can then go back to the designer with some really good questions that we can ask them so that they can make the best changes to their design based on that. So we could create our own logic as well with the designer, obviously. Maybe instead of having that go full width and height, we just have some sort of fixed ratio for that hero block that's going to make our lives easier. That text box, maybe we change that so that it shrinks a little bit. Maybe we introduce some focal points, maybe through the focal point module, or maybe we just say no, actually. In this image area, just put nice landscapes, and that's going to make everyone's lives a lot easier. If you just put in a nice, like a photo of a lake or something, doesn't matter what gets cropped away. And of course, this wouldn't be a tech presentation without talking about AI. So I want to get a show of hands in the room. How many people have at least heard of AI? Can you put your hand really high in the room? So that's probably most people, which is very, very interesting. So Amy Irving, she had a very good career in the early 80s, and she was nominated for an Academy Award. But yeah, she hasn't done a lot of material lately, so that's quite surprising that most people in the room have heard of Amy. And now I'm going to try and wrap things up. So really all of this is a challenge. I want everybody in the room to level up their dev game, basically. I want to challenge you to look for the underlying logic and algorithms in a design. And I want to also challenge you to step outside your role as a developer and embrace a little bit about what it means to be a designer. So maybe when you are expanding your skill set, instead of picking up something that's really technical, maybe you pick up something that's a little bit more in the design world, like maybe color theory or something like that. This is also about questioning your tech choices. So are there better tools? So depending on how the designer has built things in Figma, maybe we need to challenge what we are using on the tech side. Maybe Tailwind is a better option, or maybe it's not. There's a lot of different trade-offs that can be made, and a lot of the knowledge you will need to inform that choice in your tooling will come from how your designers are working. And also it's about, less about copying design tokens, copying variables from a design, and really asking yourself about the meaning of things and about what they really mean, rather than just copying across the numbers and colours as is. Yeah, so this is also what I said before, so it's about exploring the other end of the stack. So maybe we try to embrace things like color theory. Maybe as a developer you learn some Figma and how Figma works. Maybe you learn more about design systems rather than learning something that is traditionally in the developer camp. And really this is about connecting with your roots as a web designer. So that's our home base, or at least that's what I think of as being like our home base. Everyone in this room, whether you're a developer, a designer, get in touch with what it means to be a web designer. And that is all from me. So we're going to open it up to some Q&A right now. And of course, the sponsors as well. I couldn't figure out where to put the slides. Hopefully this is a good place for that. So if you've got any questions, raise your hand. I think we've got one in the back there.
That was great, thank you. I'm a designer. What can I do to help with this? How can I help bridge that gap? How can I help with that design interrogation?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because I guess that you could also, as a designer, try and pick up some things from the spectrum as well. So maybe you pick up some front-end development concepts. Maybe you learn Storybook or something like that. Something that's normally in the camp of front-end developers, and you expand. It's an interesting question. Maybe you're expanding your skill set from the other direction. Yeah. Cool. We've got one here as well.
I'll answer that for you.
Okay.
I'm a designer as well, but I'm also I've migrated, so I'm kind of hybrid. Building a rationale, whether you're on one side or the other, the rationale is going to speak for everyone involved in the project. So you may not be building a design system based on how developers expect it, but the rationale is going to put you both virtually in the room if you can't be in a room to communicate.
CV?
Oh yeah, we've got another question here.
Yeah, this is good. It seemed to focus mostly though on the visuals, colors and spacing and stuff like that. What about the UX and the flow? Like certainly where I've had issues bridging the gap with designers is in how does the flow work? What are the menu structures, what and so on. And just as an example, some of the designs that came into us looked like a really great site from 1995. Right, so a lot of the designer techniques and the flows and so on that were being presented look like just a really old website, not using the techniques that are available today. So we certainly struggle to bridge that gap.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think part of the solution is also making designers aware of how the CMS works. So for example, Drupal menus, there's a specific way that they function. Everything has a link. It can be quite tricky, I think, to put in things that aren't links in there, or maybe set links as buttons. So I think that's kind of a wee bit tricky, I think. Someone maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's sometimes a place where you can put like a CSS class on a menu item. So yeah, it's about briefing the designers on what is possible in the CMS, and hopefully then they can use that to better inform their designs as well. I think. Does that answer the question, hopefully?
Yeah, in part. I think it kind of goes both ways. Like there's things the designer doesn't know what's possible in the technology maybe, and vice versa is that the developer might not know what some of the new UI techniques are, or they're stuck in the old way. Right, I've always done it this way. This is the way you should do it. And I don't know, just that communication gap is just not nice.
Cool. Yeah. Oh yeah, we've got one more over here. I agree. I think these days, yeah, it's not really in the development toolkit to have that design awareness. And I think sometimes it can be bridged through, I mean, you can put notes in the design that make it all really obvious and kind of spell everything out, but sometimes it can be hard to put everything in there the way that it's all going to behave. So, yeah, it's a tricky one. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Any more? Oh, yes, one more up there.
Just a comment, kind of build off that. So when I am working with developers, I try to have like fairly like early upfront conversations over design, like talking over design. And I'm very much of like, if something isn't going to work, like I want to know. I want developers to like flag that and be like, we cannot do that. I sometimes feel like, especially because there is a bit of this divide, like designers live over here, developers live over here, I think sometimes it feels like there is like, people don't want to push back, or they just want, like, where I would say like, push back, like, tell me, let me know. I would sooner know what I'm working with or working against, and then make those design decisions up front, so that we don't have to kind of navigate that as the work is being done. So if there are developers who are hesitant to push back, I would advocate like do it. Like please let us know like what we've done.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tricky balance to get right, isn't it? And I think also as a developer, sometimes I'm even tempted to just say yes to things because sometimes the challenges are actually quite fun. You know, a designer might put something in there and you think, gosh, I would have never thought of that. And it's going to be a real pain in the butt to do. So actually I want to do it, but sometimes it can just take far too long or it's not worth it. So, yeah.